Hi everybody. This lecture is going to be all about taphonomy, so the study of how fossils form, and I'll more formally define this term later on. So the outline for today's lecture is, well, first, what are fossils? We're going to formally define that, and fossils can be broadly categorized into two types. These are body fossils and trace fossils, and we'll define those types. Next, we'll go over how are fossils preserved, and that really is the science of taphonomy. So basically the topic of this lecture. And lastly, we'll finish with the incompleteness of the fossil record. Okay, and how the incompleteness of the fossil record, because every individual that dies does not get fossilized. In fact, we'll see how rare fossilization is, but the incompleteness of the fossil record influences what we know about ancient life. How does it do that? Okay, so what are fossils? Okay, so I just really want to emphasize, I know I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but the fossil record is of utmost importance in the study of human evolution, aka paleoanthropology, because the only direct evidence we have for human evolution is from fossils, okay? What hominins look like, how they behaved, what they ate, when and where they lived. We can only really learn about those things through the fossil record. Okay, so what is a fossil? Well, if we break down the word, it comes from Latin fossilis, which means dug up. Okay, and basically fossils are the remains of once living organisms. Okay, that can be broken down into two categories. The first category is a body fossil, which is usually the hard part from a body, teeth, bone. Why that is, we'll go over that in a bit. Okay, so here's a classic example from paleoanthropology, which you may or may not know about. If you took ANTH 120, you definitely do the Lucy partial skeleton, right? Australopithecus afarensis. And then trace fossils, which is indirect evidence not from the body. That's how I like to think about it. So if a body fossil is any part from the body, again, usually a hard part, you can think of trace fossils as basically everything not in that category that is still the remains of a once living organism. Okay, so again, indirect evidence not from the body. These include footprints, fossil burrows, and tooth marks. Okay, again, if you took ANTH 120, you probably encountered this, but yeah, the classic Laetoli footprints in Tanzania, presumably made by Australopithecus afarensis, so the same species as Lucy. Okay, so an example of a body fossil, here's a really famous one that was discovered decades ago, but fairly recently published. And we'll learn more about this guy in a future lecture, but this is Littlefoot. Okay, it's called that because the first body part that was discovered was its foot that just like stuck out. And after a lot of painstaking excavation, you can see here just moving the surrounding sediment grain by grain, right? We can see the skull is being revealed. But yeah, fossils are basically in the ground waiting to be exhumed and discovered. And again, how does all that happen? We will go over that. All right, and once you get the skeleton out of the ground, this is what it looks like. Clean up further, you have this nice skeleton. Okay, and again, the only reason or the only way we know that this individual looked the way it did is directly through its fossil. So again, emphasizing the importance of the fossil record. Okay, here's an example of a trace fossil. This is part of a cranium, presumably belonging to Paranthropus robustus. It's a hominin taxon. But you see here two conspicuous pits, right? Dated at 1.5 million years ago from South Africa. Okay, and it's hypothesized that these two pits are caused by the canines from some carnivore. In this case, this is ancient leopard jaw. Itself a fossil, body fossil. Okay, and yeah, very gruesome diorama, but that's kind of hypothesized how these tooth pits were created. So yeah, you can kind of see here, it's kind of subtle. We have a body fossil here, which is a piece of the cranium, but the marks themselves, these tooth marks, that's the trace fossil, okay? Here's another really common one in paleoanthropology. These are cut marks, okay? So back in the day, hominins, right? We'll learn about this in more detail in a future lecture, but they made stone tools, which are basically stone knives, which they can then use to cut meat off the bone. When they do that, sometimes they'll accidentally score the bone with the sharp edge of their stone knife, and it leaves cut marks, okay, which is a trace fossil. Yeah, and these cut marks are basically preserved fossil evidence that one individual interacted with another. In this case, that a hominin was taking flesh off of some type of mammal and eating it. Okay, so that's direct preserved fossil evidence of a predator-prey interaction that we can only get through the fossil record, in this case through a trace fossil. And yeah, a stone tool is also an example of a trace fossil, unique to hominins. Here is a nice teardrop-shaped stone tool. This is known as a Schulian hand axe, which first appeared about 1.8 million years ago. Recent study pushed that back to 2 million years ago. But yeah, not from the body, but evidence that a hominin made this at this time period, at this site. Okay, and the hominin existed at that period, at that site. So this trace fossil is evidence for that hominin presence. But again, not from the body, so a trace fossil. Okay, and a paleontologist is someone who studies fossils. Okay, that could be any fossil. I know in pop culture, or maybe in common knowledge, paleontologist is often equated with a dinosaur paleontologist, someone who studies dinosaurs, but a paleontologist is really someone who studies fossils from any taxon, whether that's a hominin, ancient mammal, ancient snails, ancient plants. These are all paleontologists. So it's not just dinosaurs. Okay, and yeah, for those who don't know, Thomas Jefferson in many ways can be considered America's first paleontologist. So he was absolutely obsessed with fossils. There was an extinct ground sloth that was discovered. It actually might have been discovered on his property. You'll have to double check me on that one. But yeah, discovered, I believe sketched and reported on by Jefferson. Okay, so how are fossils preserved? This is basically the science of taphonomy. So how do body fossils form? Okay, that's basically what we're going to focus on for this taphonomy section, not really trace fossils. But if you have any questions about that, we can go over that some other time. Okay, so what happens is, and we'll go over this process in more detail in a bit, but soft tissue decays. Okay, soft tissue meaning muscle, skin, tendon, hair, eyeballs, all that stuff. Okay, basically anything that's not bone or teeth. That stuff decays, right? Whether it's consumed by a scavenger, predator, or bacteria. And then what remains are the bones and the teeth. And what happens is when these bones and teeth get buried, again, more on that later, okay, the groundwater with all of its minerals, what happens is it saturates these bones and teeth, and the minerals in the groundwater slowly replace at the cellular level these bones and teeth, okay, one by one, cell by cell. And here's a really, really stunning example of this. So as you can see, the title from this article, Fossilized Nuclei and Chromosomes Reveal 180 Million Years of Genomic Stasis in Royal Ferns. Actually, that's not that important here, but what we see is we see the fern. Okay, this is a microscopic image, so we can see the individual cells. And if you zoom in, right, you can even see the cell walls, the nucleus. And here, what we see here are different stages of, if you remember, mitosis. Okay, so I forget what's what phase, like anaphase and all that stuff, but you can see the chromosomes basically concentrating and lining up in the middle and getting ready to be torn asunder so cells can separate and go from 1 to 2 and duplicate. Okay, so this fossilization process happens at the cellular level, especially when the fossilization process is very, very, very good. Okay, so you can see that resolution here. And fossils, yes, are literally rocks. What happens is all the minerals in the surrounding groundwater replace all of the cells and the bones and teeth one by one until basically the entire bone or teeth becomes mineralized, aka a rock. Okay, And so this is why bones and teeth are so common in the fossil record, because bone is already 65% mineral. Okay, there's some soft tissue collagen that gets weathered and eroded away and replaced by minerals in the surrounding groundwater. But bone is 65% mineral. Teeth is 96% mineral. Okay, so your teeth are already pretty much rocks. So you can think about that the next time you chew on something. Okay, you're basically doing so using rocks in your mouth, which is pretty bizarre and crazy to think about. But again, they're already mostly minerals, bone, especially teeth, and so they're already on their way to becoming rocks. And the fossilization process kind of helps that along, helps them become rocks, help them become fossils. Okay, and researchers actually study this fossilization process. Okay, this is known as taphonomy. So the study of the processes of fossilization from the death of an individual to if its flesh gets consumed by carnivores, okay, to when the bones and teeth get buried by sediment, to when all those cells get replaced by minerals and surrounding groundwater, basically forming a fossil, and exposure of the fossil to the air so it could be discovered by a paleontologist. If you break down the word, okay, it's Greek. So the prefix is taphos, which means burial. Nomos means law. So it's literally the study of the laws of burial. And it's coined by this guy, Ivan Efremov, in the 1940s, I believe. Okay, and actually taphonomy originally, especially back then, okay, and even decades ago, let's say like maybe up until the 80s, taphonomy was kind of considered like a backwater science within paleontology. Okay, it was considered that the sexier types of paleontology, the subfields are actually studying the fossils themselves, and who cared about studying how these fossils actually formed. But what happened was, and so because it was kind of a backwater, it was this open scientific niche left to be filled by female scientists, okay, who back then were not very common, were more marginalized. And would you know it, okay, this one in particular, Anna K. Berensmeyer, basically made her career studying vertebrate taphonomy, mostly concentrating on mammals, and basically is equated with the field of vertebrate taphonomy. And as you can see here, Discover magazine, she has contributed so much to the field of taphonomy, but also to the field of vertebrate paleontology. That Discover magazine, I believe this is 2002, named her one of the 50 most important women in science. And so this list, you can look it up. It's not just paleontologists, it's not just biologists, it's all female scientists. So it's really, really impressive accomplishment. And if you ask anyone these days, they'll say Kay Berensmeyer, she goes by her middle name, is considered one of the greatest vertebrate paleontologists of her generation. So that is saying something. Going from studying a field, taphonomy, which was considered backwater within paleontology, to becoming one of the most prominent vertebrate paleontologists ever. It's truly remarkable. Okay, yeah, and I have a personal relationship with Kay, well, scientific, academic. She was my PhD advisor, so she was my advisor for grad school. So I have a lot of great things to say about Kay. Okay, so the way I'm going to teach this taphonomic process is kind of like instructions for becoming a fossil. Okay, it's going to be almost like a recipe. So if you want to become a fossil yourself for whatever reason, I'm not going to judge. Okay, you just follow this recipe and you will increase your chances dramatically of becoming a fossil. Okay, and as we'll see shortly after this, it is very, very rare to become a fossil. Okay, so to increase your chances, follow these steps. So one obviously is the most gruesome one. You actually have to you have to die. Okay, there's no such thing as a fossil that's actually like a living individual. Okay, two, obviously don't get completely destroyed. Okay, if for some reason your bones and teeth are completely obliterated, then those don't exist to become fossils, right? And the ways you get completely destroyed are through carnivore consumption. Okay, that's a very common one. Carnivores come along and just chew up your bones, accidentally swallow your teeth. Okay, and so here's an example of that. Okay, I have no idea how this is going to work with me recording this lecture, but you can see the taphonomic process in action. Okay, this is an elephant. This is a time lapse. The elephant has died, and now carnivores of all kinds come along and start eating at it. Okay, these are spotted hyenas. That's a leopard. That the screen is so small I can barely see these things. That's those spotted hyenas at night. You can see. Okay, so you can see some birds there. Okay, so tissue is being eaten. The guts have been all torn up. You can see all the juices just kind of leaking out. Muscle being eaten. Okay, I think an entire leg has been removed, it looks like. And it should be noted that an elephant is a large, okay, only half of it there, you can see. An elephant is a really, really large mammal. Okay, the largest living terrestrial mammal. Okay, and as I'll go over later, that means its bones are less likely to be destroyed than a smaller animal like a rodent. Maybe that's intuitive to you. So the fact that there's so much damage being done to something as large as an elephant is pretty remarkable. So we see what remains is a skull, a few bones, okay. Some stuff has been carried away, maybe destroyed. Okay, but that's the first process. All these carnivores come along, start destroying bones, moving bones around. Okay, so already we see starting with a full skeleton, only a few bones remain to be preserved as fossils. Okay, and here you can see this video. Okay, this is a spotted hyena given what looks like a cow rib. And just look at how efficiently the spotted hyena destroys this cow rib. Okay, it's removing the tissue surrounding the rib. And it's just gonna chew through this thing like a Ritz cracker. Okay, all that remained were a few fragments. So I don't know if you've ever had like at barbecue a dino rib. Not a real dino, it's a cow rib. But those bones, cow rib bones, are really large, really hard. Okay, if a human tried to chew through it, probably crack their tooth before destroying the rib bone in any meaningful way. And you saw how easily that spotted hyena just crunched up that rib. Okay, spotted hyenas, uh, in terms, at least for African carnivores, the most proficient in terms of cracking and consuming and swallowing bone. Okay. In the past, when hominids existed, there were relatives of spotted hyenas that were even more impressive in terms of how efficiently they could consume bone. Okay, so you can imagine with spotted hyenas on the landscape, if they're hungry enough and if the bone is not too big, aka like an elephant bone, okay, they're pretty much going to destroy those bones. Okay. Um, there are a few parts that a spotted hyena can't chew up, like on things like a cow, and those will remain. But a lot of the parts of the skeleton will be just consumed and eaten if the spotted hyena is hungry enough. Okay, trampling. Okay, right, as most evocative in The Lion King. I'm not going to spoil that for you, but right? When you have like a herd of wildebeest running across the savanna, okay, that is a lot of force being transmitted onto the ground. And so if there are bones there, right, you will see bones just being stepped on, cracked, and even smushed to smithereens if there are enough wildebeest and if the bone is not overly large and robust. Okay, this is actually pretty common. Okay, weathering by UV rays. So this one might not be intuitive. Okay, but bone, okay, this is another study by K. Behrensmeyer, but bone is a combination of collagen, okay, soft tissue, that imparts the bone some flexibility, and mineral, I believe it's called hydroxyapatite, and that gives bone its structural rigidity, okay? So bones actually are kind of like the best of both worlds. It's really rigid, but not overly rigid, where there is some flexibility, right? Which you want because bones endure forces all the time. Um, but what happens is when a bone is exposed to UV rays from the sun, okay, the UV rays break down the collagen, okay? And then if you can see here, what happens is you start getting fine cracks, okay? You start getting flakes forming, and then eventually the bone starts splintering, becomes this fibrous texture, okay? And eventually it just falls apart. So if a bone is left on the landscape in the sun for long enough, UV rays from the sun will just break down the bone itself. Okay, again, there is a size dependency here where large bones like elephants will take much longer to weather, but again, another process that will destroy a bone before it even has inkling of a chance of becoming a fossil. Okay, so even before the burial process, which I'll go over shortly, many individuals and bones don't survive. Okay, so hopefully I've impressed that upon you. There are just so many processes out there that quote unquote want to destroy bone, whether it's carnivores, trampling, weathered by UV rays. Okay, here's a study, again, by K. Behrensmeyer. So when I said her name is synonymous with vertebrate taphonomy, I was not exaggerating. Okay, so it's a study done on wildebeest. Okay, what we have here is we have 152 bones within a wildebeest skeleton. A stable population has 1,000 individuals. Okay, a certain number die and their carcasses are left on the landscape. That's 250. So already we're seeing we go from 1,000 to 50. Okay, and after a round of carnivores getting at it, we see about 100 of those 250 carcasses are destroyed or not really recognizable. And on average, we go from 152 bones to 105. Okay, so that's just after carnivory. And then after being left on the landscape, being exposed to the sun, those UV rays, you get weathering. Okay, and then that destroys even more bones. So now you go from 105 to 52. Okay, we started with 152 in an individual's body. Now we're down to on average 52. Okay, and then what actually gets buried is, let's say on average, 8 bones in an individual out of the original 152, and then 50 individuals out of the original 1,000. Okay, so you see how small percentage in terms of the bones and number of individuals that actually get buried relative to the stable living population of wildebeest. Okay, and burial is a really, really key step in becoming a fossil, as we'll see now. Burial. Okay, this is a fake image, but it kind of illustrates the point I want to make here, which is that, right, there are all these processes. I listed 3 major ones. There are others. Okay, again, there's all these things out there that just want to destroy bones because bones have all these nutrients, right? Phosphorus, that's the main one. And so if an ecosystem is working efficiently, right, and there's no waste, all that bone basically gets destroyed and recycled and gets input back into the system, right? It's just not locked up in these bones. So carnivore consumption, right? These carnivores are consuming these minerals. Trampling kind of breaks it up into smaller bits, and maybe then it can make its way into the soil. Same with weathering by UV rays. And what happens with burial is that you could think of it as like a protective blanket. Okay, once um, Bones are buried by sediment, right? And we talked about this process, I believe it was last lecture. Anytime sediment is being carried by water, water reaches the level surface, right? Water loses all its momentum, its ability to carry that sediment, and just dumps it wherever the ground is level. Dumps all that sediment out. If there are bones there, it'll bury the bones. Okay. And again, the sediment kind of forms like this protective security blanket, so it can't be reached and consumed by carnivores. So it can't be directly trampled by, for example, a wildebeest stampede. And it's definitely protected from the sun and those UV rays. Okay, so if you die and are immediately buried such that you're protected from these elements and others, you're well on your way to becoming a fossil. And in fact, that's why we see the fossil record for hominins improved so dramatically during Neanderthal times, because for one reason or another, Neanderthals started burying their dead. Okay, and then you have to survive chemical breakdown, okay, because there are all these processes underground, right? I guess the most popular one is soils. When they break down decaying plant matter, they become really acidic. Okay, that can break down bones underneath the surface. Sediment compaction. Okay, sediment is not light. It's very heavy if you've ever moved around buckets of dirt. Okay, so if there's a bunch of sediment on top of you burying you, okay, it can crush and basically turn into particles, bones, right? I think I have an example of that. And then you have to hopefully mineralize. So hopefully there's groundwater or minerals in the surrounding sediment and of the proper sort that can actually come in and replace the cells in your bones and teeth. Okay, yeah, so here's an example. This is a famous fossil from Olduvai Gorge. Okay, its specimen number is OH24. But yeah, it was basically pancaked when they found it. So all this sediment on top, just providing all that weight, smushing this thing down. And so it actually had to be reconstructed. Okay, so we do have a cast of this. I'm sure you'll interact with it at some point. But yeah, know that it was reconstructed. Okay, and then yeah, once fossils get buried, okay, paleontologists, if a fossil is like 10 feet underground, no way a paleontologist can find it. Um, so the fossil actually has to be exposed to the surface, okay, whether it's the elements, wind, water that are eroding away the overlying sediment and exposing the fossil, or paleontologists kind of dig around and expose the fossil themselves. Here's an example, a fossil being actively eroded or weathered out. Okay, that's the only way a paleontologist can find it. And discovery. So even if a fossil is weathered out, if a paleontologist never finds it, okay, what happens is now the fossil is exposed to elements, water, rain, chemical weathering at the surface, those trampling wildebeest again. The fossil can be destroyed. And so there's a lot of luck involved where a paleontologist finds a fossil, okay? Paleontologists can't get there too early because the fossil's still underground, has to be weathered out. Paleontologists can't get there too late or else the fossil could be destroyed once it's exposed to elements. So it's this kind of Goldilocks zone where a paleontologist stumbles across a fossil and discovers it. Okay, so this basically summarizes everything I just talked about for a hominin. I'll let you read this on your own time. Well, I guess briefly, right? An individual dies, its bones are exposed, so all the soft tissue has decayed for one reason or another. Okay, looks like there's still a lot of bones left on the skeleton, so for a paleontologist, pretty lucky. Right, it gets buried. In this case, I guess the lake level rises, dumps sediment on it. You can see there that little protective blanket covered by a bunch of layers of sediment, right? Again, we call that strata. And we see there the original layer that the bone was buried in, skeleton, all the overlying strata, right? The bones have, each of the cells have been replaced by minerals. Basically, it's a fossil exposed to the elements, a paleontologist comes along, discovers this fossil, We'll need to excavate to fully get it out. And then, yeah, then you can study it. Okay, and this is a common diagram you see in taphonomy, where the size of the circle kind of represents is very similar to that wildebeest size slide I showed earlier, that Kay Berensmeyer study, where we track the number of individuals in the stable population to the number that actually get buried, the number of bones within a given individual, and on average, number of bones that actually get buried. And so at each step of the taphonomic process, right, you lose bones and individuals along the way. Okay, so in life, maybe you have this entire circle representing the entire living population and all the bones contained therein, right? We talk about death, decomposition of the soft tissue, right? Burial, being exposed, fossils being collected, curated in museums. But at each step of the taphonomic pathway, basically the recipe I showed earlier, you get a loss of individuals, a loss of bones at each step. Okay, so you start off with a really large sample. Each step, less and less remain. Okay, such that what actually gets collected as fossils is but a very small sample of the original living assemblage. Oh my God, I'm still under the weather. My throat is just so dry. Give me 1 second. Okay, I think I'm back recording. Okay, so yeah, the figure again just emphasizes there's loss of bones and individuals at every step of the taphonomic pathway. Okay, so who's most likely to become a fossil? Organisms with hard body parts. So again, bones, especially teeth, they're already well on their way to becoming rocks and fossils because what was it? Bones, 65% mineral, teeth, at least 95%. Okay, so those organisms with hard parts, like clams with shells, right? They're more likely to preserve. Something like a jellyfish, where they have a longer path to take in terms of fully becoming mineralized in a rock. Jellyfish fossils, they do exist, they're extremely rare. Large-bodied organisms, okay, I already alluded to this previously, but those individuals with really large bones, like an elephant, those bones are more resistant to those taphonomic processes that want to destroy you, like whether it's carnivore consumption, trampling, or weathering by UV rays. Okay, larger bones are going to be more resistant to that than smaller bones. As a quick example, like spotted hyena, right? I already mentioned, really proficient bone cracker and consumer. If you have something that's like a goat size, spotted hyena can basically consume all those bones, no problem. Okay, but something like a cow size, spotted hyena can consume some of those bones and some parts of certain bones, but not all of them. Okay, some bones are just too robust or don't really have much nutrients that it gets kind of ignored by spotted hyena. And organisms that live in depositional environments, right? Remember I said that burial is a very, very important process in the formation of a fossil. If there is no burial, you will not become a fossil. So if you live in the middle of a grassy plain, okay, and you die, you most likely won't be preserved as a fossil. Whereas here I show, I don't know if these are crocodiles or alligators, but living in a lake or a swamp, right? There's a watery medium. When there's flooding, you probably get deposition of sediment. And so an environment like this, way more likely for bones to become fossils. Okay, so I hope I've impressed upon you by now that becoming a fossil is super, super rare. Okay, and so the fossil record is notoriously, we call it incomplete. Okay, out of all the individuals that have ever lived, we can even talk about the history of life. Very few of those individuals actually make it into the fossil record, become fossils, and are discovered by paleontologists and enter human knowledge. Okay, so how does this incompleteness actually influence what we know about ancient life? Okay, so how common is it for organisms to become fossils? Okay, it's very rare. So whenever I teach this, I say becoming a fossil is like winning the lottery. Okay, because all those processes that I talked about, right, that recipe for becoming a fossil, All of those things have to go right for you to become a fossil. And even if you do become a fossil, most fossils are actually never discovered because paleontologists aren't out there all the time looking for fossils, right? A lot of paleontologists are academics. We are teaching during the academic year, right? And so I shudder to think about it, but yeah, most fossils that get weathered out, we paleontologists probably don't get there in time, and they probably get destroyed forever, and we never learn about them. We never know about them. Okay, so out of all species that have ever lived, okay, this has been estimated, so over the history of life, it is estimated that only 1 to 2% are preserved as fossils. Okay, so that's incredible. So everything we know about the history of life, T-Rex, Triceratops, trilobites, those horseshoe crab looking things, right? Those represent only 1 to 2% of all species that have ever lived. So that is pretty wild to think about. And the optimistic thing is that there's so much we have learned about the history of life just from this 1 to 2%. Okay, so scientists are super efficient. And out of all the individuals that have ever lived, okay, so the previous slide was talking about species as individuals, only a small minority are preserved and discovered. I don't know if anyone has actually estimated what this percentage would be, but it's got to be super tiny. I imagine definitely less than 1%, less than 1/100th of a percent, I would say. Probably maybe even much smaller. That's just me pulling a number out of my keister. Okay, and within a given individual, okay, few body parts are preserved. Okay, so this is famous partial skeleton from a site Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Specimen number is OH62. Okay, and you can see here, right, just the skull, just bunch of fragments. Okay, all this process we talked about earlier. In this case, this one was probably sediment compaction, all that heavy dirt and sediment on top of this fossil, basically crushing its smithereens. An arm and a leg and a piece of the other leg. Okay, that is it. And when paleoanthropologists discover something like this, they freak out, they celebrate, they call this a partial skeleton, which you might be thinking yourself, how is this a skeleton? That is completely asinine and ridiculous. And it is, but it just goes to show you how rare it is to get associated what we call crania. So basically stuff in the head, the skull, and postcrania, everything from the neck down. Okay, so anytime we have a partial skeleton like this, we get really excited. But yeah, just to reiterate, within a given individual, very few body parts are preserved. Okay, and this idea was best exemplified by Charles Darwin, okay, in On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. He has this quote, I look at the natural geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved. And of each page, only here and there a few lines. Okay, the fossil record has become a lot better in terms of our knowledge of it since Darwin's time, but this still pretty much captures the idea of how incomplete the fossil record is. And actually, Darwin used this idea of how incomplete the fossil record is to kind of argue against, or, well, let me back up. So again, Darwin really emphasized phyletic gradualism, right? That these fossil lineages, they evolved gradually in some morphological trait over time at a steady, constant rate, okay? And the majority of evolutionary change we see in the history of life is due to this phyletic gradualism. Gradual, constant change within lineages. And anytime you didn't see that in the fossil record, and I think he rarely saw it, he actually invoked the incompleteness of the fossil record to say, well, we shouldn't expect to see it because the fossil record is so incomplete, right? A short chapter has been preserved, and of each page, only here and there a few lines. So, you know, people don't get to say this often, but this quote is actually makes Darwin's theory more unscientific. Okay, if we were in class, I would kind of ask you to break that down more and we could discuss it more together, but we're not together. And so the idea here is that if Darwin finds evidence of phyletic gradualism in the fossil record, he's like, great, my theory is supported, okay, at least for this one lineage, in this one time period, in this one site. And if it's not supported, we don't see phyletic gradualism, Darwin can say, oh, it's actually phyletic gradualism in reality, it's just the fossil record is so incomplete, we only get snapshots of it, that we're not going to see all the intermediate gradations needed to demonstrate phyletic gradualism. And so what that meant was Darwin's theory, in a sense, based on this quote, became unfalsifiable. There was no way to falsify his theory. Okay, if it showed phyletic gradualism, this fossil lineage, great. If it didn't, he can invoke incompleteness and say in reality it was actually phyletic gradualism. And I don't want to get to the details, but yeah, if a theory doesn't make these falsifiable expectations predictions, that does make it unscientific according to certain philosophers of science. So Darwin invoking the incompleteness of the fossil record to kind of protect his theory and those long-term predictions of phyletic gradualism we see in the fossil record, it was no bueno. Not good from Chuck. Okay, so the incompleteness of the fossil record. Despite everything I just said, that is very much a thing. That is very true. But how does this incompleteness affect our knowledge of where and when hominins lived? Okay, so here's a metaphor. So I'm going to basically extrapolate this to understanding how long certain hominin species live for, from when it's speciated to when it went extinct, to its geographic range. Okay, the range of where it lived across space. But before that, we're going to use this metaphor of a dartboard. Okay, and imagine we randomly throw darts at this dartboard. Okay, now I want to pose to you when I do that. Okay, I randomly throw it at the dartboard, right? Dart hits. If a dart falls outside the dartboard, it doesn't count, right? We don't consider those darts. You're a very bad dart player. And so my question to you is, if I draw a polygon around these darts, okay, is that polygon going to be less than, equal to, or greater than the area of this polygon, less than, equal to, or greater than the area of the dartboard? Okay, hopefully most of you can intuit it's going to be almost always less than. Right, so here we see the triangle. The area of this triangle definitely less than the area of the dartboard here. Okay, if I throw more darts, okay, again, randomly, it falls off the dartboard, doesn't count, right? And then I draw a polygon around the outside, right? Hopefully, again, you can see it's going to be less than the area of the dartboard. But you can see here, the more darts we threw, right, the more the dartboard gets covered. So this polygon, the blue one with more darts, is actually larger than the polygon with just 3 darts of the triangle, okay? And so where I'm going with this metaphor is that the darts represent successful fossilization and discovery, okay? When fossilization and discovery is very poor, like with the orange darts, okay, we get a small area. But the more darts we have, the better the fossilization, the more individuals are fossilized and discovered. It's a larger area. Okay, where am I going with this? How am I bringing this back to space and time, as I mentioned earlier? Okay, basically, there are lots of spatial temporal gaps in the fossil record, again, exemplified by that Darwin quote, but keep that dartboard metaphor in your head. Okay? So if we think about a hominin species existing through time, okay, there is a date at which it's speciated and was quote unquote born, and there's a date at which this species goes extinct, right? This range represents the dartboard, but now it's this only one dimension, which is time. So you could think about collapsing that dartboard Basically, let's say we take the left side of the dartboard, the right side, and then we crush it. Okay, so it's basically it just becomes this thin vertical line. Same with those darts. Okay, so the dartboard is now this. And again, those darts represent the fossilization and recovery process. Okay, so if we throw 3 darts, boom, boom, boom. Again, if it falls off the dartboard, doesn't count. In this case, you could probably see what that is. That is, right? You cannot have a fossil of a hominid species that appears after it goes extinct, right? Doesn't make sense. Same for, you can't have one older than when it speciates, okay? And with 3 darts, right, thrown randomly at this now one-dimensional dartboard, we have a range that looks like this, okay? 3 fossils preserved and discovered. And what we see is the temporal range, the observed temporal range that we know from the fossil record is shorter than the actual true range, which is something we don't know, okay? Because again, we can only ever know about this stuff through the fossils. Okay, so it's shorter. Excuse me, the oldest fossil that we discover is something called the first appearance datum, okay, or FAD is an abbreviation. The youngest one is called the last appearance datum, or the LAD. Okay, you may encounter these terms if you read textbook or the primary literature for your term paper. Okay, but I lost my train of thought. Okay, yeah, and these are just 3 kind of fossils preserved. And again, just with the previous slide, if we throw more darts at the dartboard, if more fossils are preserved and discovered, okay, this range becomes larger, okay? And it slowly approaches the true range, but only ever gets there when all the basically fossilization and recovery is at 100%, which is never true, because again, as I showed on a previous slide, fossilization is extremely, extremely rare, okay? So the takeaway from this is that the observed temporal range that we know from the fossil record is almost always, in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and say always shorter than the true temporal range. And as the fossil record gets better and better and better, as we explore more, discover more, that range gets extended. The FAD approaches the true speciation date. The LAD approaches the true extinction date. Okay, it's like a limiting phenomenon for those of you who are familiar with calculus. And the same metaphor can be applied to space. Okay, I'll go over this quickly. Right, hominins in reality maybe lived all throughout this area. Okay, so that you draw a polygon. This is known as a geographic range. Okay, for the entire species. This is the true range. But, right, again, the darts at the dartboard, because fossilization and recovery process is not 100%. Okay, we only have smatterings of individuals at certain areas who get preserved as fossils and recovered, such that the observed geographic range is almost always, in fact, I'm just going to say always smaller than the geographic range. Okay, this is one of the big ways the incompleteness of the fossil record influences the temporal range and the geographic range of these hominin species. Okay, so because of this incomplete fossil preservation and recovery, okay, the goalposts are constantly changing. In this case, we're going to focus on the first appearance date, the oldest currently known fossil. Okay, we're going to talk about our own species, Homo sapiens, the fossil record of the oldest, aka earliest Homo sapiens. Okay, in 1982, it was, well, massive date range, lots of error in South Africa. Okay, South Africa is notoriously difficult to date, although recently newer methods have been invented to get better, more precise dates. But back then, in fact, we can even just go with the oldest bounding date, 115,000 years ago. So in 1982, the oldest Homo sapiens known was from South Africa, dated 115,000 years ago. Okay, 2 decades later, lo and behold, an even older Homo sapiens is discovered in Ethiopia, dated to 160,000 years old. Okay, and I should note that every time someone finds the oldest Homo sapiens and publishes it, they get New York Times article, right? They get a lot of coverage and kind of almost become a celebrity. Okay, 2 years later, okay, this fossil was already discovered, but it was redated, and it's now 200,000 years. Okay, same with another site in Morocco, redated in 2017, so fairly relatively recently, dated 300,000 years old. Okay, and again, each time this happens, you get a nice New York Times article. Basically, the point here is that it should not be surprising. This is exactly what we expect based on what I taught you on the previous slide, right? The more fossils we discover, the more we push the FAD to older dates to where it's approaching the true speciation date. I will not be surprised when in the future we discover an even older Homo sapiens and that they're going to get a bunch of news coverage when, again, this is something that is really shouldn't be surprising. This is something we should expect. Okay, but here's an actual historical example of showing you how when our knowledge of the fossil record, in this case for hominins, for Homo sapiens, gets better, right? The FAD gets pushed back older and older towards its true speciation date, which we don't know of. And likewise, people don't care about the youngest as much, but the younger fossil, the youngest known fossil, the last appearance datum, LAD will be pushed and will approach the true extinction date. Okay, this also emphasizes that through field work and discovery fossils, that in and of itself we cannot depend on to tell us when, in this case, Homo sapiens actually speciated. Okay, because there's always a possibility that there's an older fossil out there. Okay. And so the only way to really know or estimate the true temporal range, the true speciation date, the true extinction date, is to use statistics. And so this is something that I've worked on and I published on. So I did it for the fossil lineage Australopithecus annamensis afarensis, okay, which Lucy is a part of. Each of these vertical lines represents an age when a fossil from the species is preserved and recovered. And so the gray, okay, is the observed temporal range. Okay, so you can see time here. The white here is the estimated true speciation date, and the white here is estimated true extinction date. So we see the extinction is actually not that large. That's because the fossil record for this species, especially for hominin, is already really impressive. Hominins, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but that slide I showed earlier with the temporal range on the left, the geographic range on the right, that phenomenon, the dartboard phenomenon, if you will, is exacerbated for hominins because they are super, super rare in the fossil record. Okay, so for any given fossil mammal assemblage, hominins make up on the order 0.1% of all of those fossil mammals. Okay, they are very, very rare. Why hominins were such a rare component of their mammal community is still an open question. Okay, but even given that this lineage fossil record is pretty good, and so the extinction is not that much. But we can actually estimate the true speciation date, the true extinction date, and this bar is just a confidence interval. Anytime in statistics you estimate some number, there's always some error associated with it. In this case, this is expressed as a confidence interval, basically just an error bar. Okay, what about incompleteness across space? Okay, this is hot off the press, published by these two researchers. Spatial sampling bias influences our understanding of early hominin evolution in Eastern Africa. Okay, and so this study did a number of things, but it noted that the early hominin fossil record is pretty much concentrated in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, and a smattering of sites, one here in Central Africa and one here in Northern Africa. Okay, I go into why this is in a future lecture, but obviously this is not randomly, sites are not randomly distributed across the African continent. Okay, and so this paper asked, it focused on Eastern Africa here, but all the sites being concentrated here, hominin sites, does that bias what we know about hominins? and let's say their ecology. Okay, and so do you think the spatial distribution of these sites, particularly the ones in Eastern Africa, is representative of where hominins lived during their lifetimes? Uh, the answer is almost certainly no, right? Hominins probably lived further spread around Africa, but what gets preserved in the fossil record and recovered by paleontologists is just in this area. And again, we'll go over why that is in a future lecture. Yes. Okay. And so what the study did was it looked at species living today, okay, those that live in both that Eastern African kind of sliver we saw on the previous slide, right? That's known as East African Rift Valley, Rift System, EARS. And so out of all the living mammals today that live in the EARS and outside of it, okay, they looked at across its geographic range for each species, the range of temperatures they live in, the amount of precipitation, okay, and all these other climatic variables. And so what this is a distribution, okay, and so, right, the higher it is, the more sites within its geographic range that species experiences more of these temperature values, less of these temperature values. That's the way to think about it. And so the takeaway here is that the beige represents the full species range for these 9 different climatic variables. The blue represents the range of those climatic variables just for inside that East African Rift system, okay? And if the East African Rift system represented the climatic conditions outside of it, these two distributions, blue and beige, should overlap completely. Oh my God, I think I just realized these two are at George Washington University, and these are George Washington University colors because that's where I did my PhD. And so that's what's going on here. Okay. Anyway, sorry, that's what you call ADHD. So if the East African Rift system was representative, the climatic conditions of outside the rift for these species, then these distributions should look exactly the same. The fact that they don't means that the climatic conditions experienced by these species within the rift is different from what's experienced outside the rift. Okay, what that means for hominins is that if we can extrapolate this condition to these ancient hominins, that means we're only getting a partial picture of the climatic conditions experienced by these hominins just from the fact that the fossils are preserved and recovered in the East African Rift Valley only. Okay, that's the takeaway here. Okay, so basically we have to recognize that fossils are almost certainly a biased spatial sample of where these individuals and species actually lived during their lifetime. But they still contain useful information, okay? Even if it's biased, it's still worth studying the known fossil record, and the known fossil record is not completely worthless. And in fact, in this case, this restricted spatial sample within the East African Rift system, I would say is actually not an overly big deal because at least this bias is consistent through time, okay? Because these fossils, sites, hominins, again, for the earlier record, are very much heavily concentrated within that East African Rift system, okay? And so if they're concentrated in there and do so through time, then that bias stays constant through time. And so it becomes an apples to apples comparison, okay? It's not like in one time period, we actually get sites preserved outside the Rift Valley, and we actually get some glimpse of a climatic condition experienced by hominins outside the Rift Valley. It's always contained, okay? And so we are comparing apples to apples, and then we can see how the climatic conditions and ecological conditions have changed through time or not within this bias sample. But again, at least that bias is consistent through time. Okay, so in conclusion, taphonomy is a study of how body and trace fossils form from death to burial to discovery. For taphonomy, I focus solely on body fossils, but if you want to learn more about how trace fossils are formed, well, I guess you could use Google or ChatGPT, or you could come talk to me during my office hours. Okay, fossilization is rare. Again, I say it's just like winning the lottery because a lot of processes have to go right. Okay, a lot of those processes that destroy your bones, they cannot happen. You have to be saved from those, among other processes in the taphonomic pathway. The fossilization process biases spatial temporal distributions of fossil taxa. So again, that's my dartboard metaphor. And you can statistically account for this. For example, as I showed for that Australopithecus animensis afarensis fossil lineage with temporal ranges. And, this bias, it's good to keep in mind. It's perhaps okay if we're mindful of it. And that's what I was trying to communicate to you. I don't know how well I did on the previous slide with the fact that this bias is consistent through time. Okay, and so our knowledge of these hominins is equally kind of truncated at all time periods. So it's still an apples to apples comparison.